Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time in these 2 hours looking at a number of different issues. In studio with me is the individual that oftentimes sits in front of this microphone, Dr. Nick Pitts. Nick, how you doing today?
Hey, Kerby, doing so well this morning. How are you?
Very good. And we also have your daily briefing, which we're going to get to in just a minute, but we're going to postpone some of that discussion because we are privileged to have in the studio with us for about the first half hour State Representative Jeff Leach. He's been on the program with us in the past, represents House District 67, a graduate of SMU Law School, and was called one of the rising stars in the Texas legislature. And Jeff Leach, it is always great to have you in studio.
Hey, it's great to be here this morning. Good morning.
I know you will have to head out in just a few minutes to catch an airplane, so we wanted to catch some of the issues as quickly as we can. And one of those, which Nick and I have talked about before, is when we look at the national level, we see that oftentimes good legislation in the House of Representatives, when it goes to the U.S. Senate, goes to die. In Texas, it seems just the opposite. Good legislation in the Senate goes to the House to die. That has a lot to do with the Speaker of the House that has been there. And I remember a very famous press conference where you talked about the fact that we've put up with this enough. We're going to really call him out. Talk about that for just a minute.
Well, no, that's absolutely right. If you look at the past legislative session, specifically the last legislative session in 2017, the Texas Senate very quickly and rapidly and aggressively passed conservative reforms, whether it's with respect to property tax reform, sanctuary cities, pro-life legislation, school choice. The Texas Senate, like clockwork, was passing out conservative reforms that the people of Texas have said overwhelmingly that they want. Those reforms would come over, those pieces of legislation would come over to the House and be stalled in committees, oftentimes be killed behind closed doors. And that's frustrating for a conservative member in the Texas House because I felt like I wasn't able to represent and fight for and advocate for my constituents who sent me there to enact bold, meaningful conservative reforms. So the good news is that outgoing House leadership is just that. They're outgoing. We have an opportunity to elect a new, fresh, conservative House leadership, and I'm confident that we'll do just that next session.
Okay, so with the new session coming up and then also just the new leadership, what are some of those initiatives that you're looking to press right now?
Well, the people of Texas overwhelmingly are telling us what they want. Mm-hmm. It's very clear. It shouldn't be a secret to any of us what the people want. They want property tax relief and reform. Mm-hmm. They want school finance reform. They want us to focus on education instead of continuing to kick the can down the road. They want us to continue to ensure that our border is safe, that we reform, that we do away with sanctuary cities once and for all. They want us to continue to fight for life from conception to natural death. And so these are the things that conservatives, that Texans are telling us that they want. And we have to go into next legislative session and aggressively work to deliver those things on their behalf.
Let's see if we can, since we have a link to your website, some of those issues. You mentioned life, and one of the things you talk about is the promoting of culture of life. And during the 83rd legislative session, I know you co-authored House Bill 2. Let's talk about that, because that would actually ban the practice of abortion after 20 weeks of conception. Here's a good example of something that has happened in the states that we still can't get happening in the federal government, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And look, House Bill 2 was a giant step forward. In fact, I think if you look at legislation over the past 30 to 40 years at the state level, House Bill 2 passed by the Texas legislature was a remarkable, maybe the most monumental step forward at the state level. The biggest portion of that, there were a number of moving parts, but the biggest portion was prohibiting abortion after 20 weeks. Science has now proven that a baby can feel pain at 20 weeks. Of course, we would love to do away with abortion altogether. That bill is being challenged through our federal courts. It's unfortunate that the United States Congress can't pass it. Again, they've all promised to their constituents that they would do these things, but there's a difference between campaigning at home and delivering on those promises when it comes time to govern.
Yeah, I think you accentuate a really good point in the sense that even now science is proving that babies are hypersensitive to this type of pain, and our peers among the world right now are entities like North Korea and Syria right now relative to kind of our bans that we have on abortion. It's just unacceptable.
That's right. It's look, there's no more important duty of government than to protect innocent life, and when science is finally catching up to what we've known to be the case, what the Bible tells us to be the case, that there's a life in the womb, and when that life can feel pain, when it recoils, when you prod it with an instrument, when heartbeats escalate, when you're doing certain procedures, we know those babies can feel pain, and so we have an obligation to protect that life. It's unfortunate that some Democrats and Republicans refuse to do so.
Yes. If you'd like to join us, we will give you that opportunity, 1-800-351-1212. Or if you want to just sit back and hear from, of course, Nick Pitts and Jeff Leach, we certainly encourage you to do that as well. One of the other issues I wanted to get, and we'll go through these really quickly because I know you're heading out the door in just a few minutes, is religious liberty. And that's something we talk about. Somebody that sits in that chair so often is a good friend of yours, Kelly Shackelford. But you co-authored a bill that I wanted to alert our pastors about. It's called the Pastor Protection Act. Talk about that for just a minute.
Well, we passed the Pastor Protection Act actually in 2015, and that was in response to what was happening at that time. You had the Houston mayor, Anise Parker, who was actually subpoenaing the sermons of pastors. And I know several of those pastors who received subpoenas. That is a patent on its face violation of our fundamental religious liberties guaranteed by the Constitution. And so we passed a Pastor Protection Act that will protect pastors and their sermons from any government subpoena power.
That's phenomenal. And speak to the value, just for our audience that might not understand the value of religious liberty here in the American context. Like our founders believed it to be true that religion was produced this virtue inside of us, and virtue was a good ally of limited government. And speak a little bit to that.
Well, look, there's maybe separation of church and state. We can discuss that, but there's not separation of God and country when you look at our founders and what they intended, how they intended the American form of government to work and to operate. And the church is supposed to be protected by the state. And when you see the government attacking the church and prohibiting the church from doing what the church does best, and that includes not only worshiping and sermons, that includes serving people. Many times the government gets in the way of what the church is actually, what our mission is. And so we as policymakers, as Christian conservatives, people who believe in our heritage and faith and family and freedom and the principles upon which this country were founded, we have to not just campaign and say the right things, we have to aggressively work and fight every single day on the floor of the Texas House or the Texas Senate, in the halls of government, to protect our fundamental constitutional rights. Most importantly, our right to religious liberty.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, Nick, I'm thinking he probably has something to say about the Second Amendment, since he actually co-authored a book on open carry, and that's been in the news. Get into a couple of other issues as well. Let me just mention, though, that we have a link to jeffleach.com, and there is an opportunity for you to see some of that. We've also posted information about these issues that we're talking about right now, so those are some things that we wanted you to be aware of, and you can find those at pointofview.net. Also, if you would like to follow him on Twitter, and I do, and Instagram, and I see a daughter Daddy Dance the other night that you posted. And
it was wonderful.
Things.
I'm still recovering from it.
So that is good. And it wasn't banned. As you well know, Nick, sometimes these daughter-daddy dances have been banned because they're what? Not transgender enough? Is that the issue?
Not gender equality is being threatened.
Yeah. Well, in the state of Texas, they still have it here, and he did that with his daughter. So, again, if you would like to follow Jeff Leach, you can do so. He does not have a primary opponent, but we'll certainly talk about this upcoming election as well, because he's been saying a few things about negative campaigning. I know that will surprise you, but we'll get into that. And if you'd like to join us, maybe you have some comments, 1-800-351-1212, or otherwise just sit back, and we'll continue our conversation with Jeff Leach. And, of course, Nick Pitts in studio with me. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we have once again been hearing that we need to do something to stem gun violence. Even though most gun purchases are significantly regulated, are there any gun law reforms being proposed that make some sense? Well, Benjamin Durker, writing in The Federalist, proposes some reforms of the National Instant Criminal Background Check System that would make a difference. The system is composed of 3 databases, but not all relevant data is listed. For example, the Air Force failed to provide important information about the man who killed more than 24 people at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Legislation has been proposed to address this problem of inadequate records, but failed to pass in Congress. Another piece of legislation that has been proposed but not passed would increase criminal prosecutions of felons who tried to buy guns and would also criminalize straw purchases. The bill proposed by Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Charles Grassley would address the problem of people who lie on applications. Cruz says that in 2010 there were 48,000 felons and fugitives who lied and illegally tried to purchase guns. They prosecuted only 44 of them. David French writes about a way to deal with people who already have guns and pose a danger to society. It's called a gun violence restraining order. Various versions of these laws have been working their way through states, and it would empower family members and others close to a potential shooter to use the courts to temporarily take an individual's guns away. Obviously, it needs various safeguards. French shows how this law might have stopped at least 4 of the mass shootings in the last 4 years. We keep hearing that we need to do something. I think these types of common sense gun law reforms might actually prevent the next mass shooting. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thank you for joining us today, and we have in studio with us for just a few more minutes the State Representative Jeff Leach represents the House District 67. And, of course, we have Nick Pitts here, as he always is, in front of the microphone. And, Nick, I know we have some other good questions for the representative, don't we?
Yeah, so Representative Leach, I'm really interested relative to education. What's being done? Where's some of the movement that's happening relative to education?
Well, there's a big conversation with respect to education. You can talk about assessment, accountability, teacher retainment, school finance, of course, is the big elephant in the room. The reality is we have a constitutional duty to provide strong public schools. That's in the Texas Constitution. We have about 5 million students in Texas, 4.5 million in our public schools. And then the other, 500,000 are in private schools or homeschooled. And we have to get education right in Texas. We've been kicking the can down the road on school finance, on testing. Look, I have 2 children in public schools now, and I see some of these challenges. I hear from the educators, from the teachers, from the parents, from the kids themselves. We have to get education right to ensure that Texas remains strong for generations to come.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things that we find ourselves in, because it's almost a false dichotomy that's been painted, whereby you either are completely supporting charter schools and some of those movements to the neglect of public school teachers that are working in and out, and just understand that they're in a hard place right now. When you have 40% of children that are being born into kind of families that are unwed, and so that's just a very difficult situation for a child to be raised. And then just understand it's less than desirable outcomes that are happening right now in schools.
That's right.
And the DISD, for example, 12% of high school seniors that are graduating can read at a senior level. 19% can do math at a senior level. Yeah. That's less than desirable to be perpetuated into the future. So something needs to be done.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Nick. And we, education is going to be the big issue next session, along with property tax reform, of course, all the other issues we've talked about as well. But we have to get this right. We absolutely do.
What about curriculum? That's something that you've passed legislation on. And again, if you want to start a discussion on this program, all you have to do is say the words Common Core.
That's right.
Or C-Scope or something like that. Talk about that, because you have been at the forefront of looking at curriculum and flawed curriculum, haven't you?
I have, specifically the flawed curriculum part, Kirby, and you're right. And we've seen some very alarming trends about what's actually showing up in our kids' classrooms across the state. Now, the good news is over the past few sessions, we have passed legislation to do away with Common Core, to do away with C-Scope. The problem is the legislation we passed didn't have the enforcement mechanisms that we needed, didn't have the teeth. And so one of the things I'm working on for next session is to come back and put some teeth in those bills that we passed, to not just say you can't use these things, but to say if you do use these things, if you try to sneak them through, then there's going to be penalties. We've seen them go away, but we're still seeing some evidence that some might still be there. So we're going to continue to keep our hand on the State Board of Education, school boards, educators, and the curriculum across the state.
One of the things I've said, Jeff, so often when you've been on the program is to encourage other people to follow some of the things that you're doing. So there's a link to jeffleach.com. Some of our listeners are saying, well, I don't live in Plano and Allen, so you're not my representative. That's good. What is your representative going to do? And it seems to me that you've got some ideas and even model legislation that you would encourage them to tell their representative to sign on to.
That's exactly right. I encourage your listeners to reach out. I would hope that their state representatives would be accessible and responsive to when they reach out. But if they're not, feel free to reach out to me. Even though they can't vote for me, Kirby, I can vote for them on the floor of the Texas House. And, the best ideas, the best solutions, the best legislation comes from the people themselves. They're my boss, and I answer to them. And so if there's concerns or questions or ideas, proposed solutions that people have with respect to any of these issues, please feel free to reach out to me.
What about Second Amendment? We waited till now, and certainly that's been in the news. But if I remember right, didn't you co-author an open carry piece of legislation? Explain that to some people right now that are convinced that more guns are not the answer.
Well, we, in 2015, very proudly passed the open carry bill, which will allow licensed LTC holders in Texas to openly carry. And you know what's interesting, Kirby, is we're the 46th state to pass open carry. 45 other states had some form of open carry, and you would expect Texas to be on the forefront of these issues, right? But we were not. And so we proudly passed that open carry bill. We haven't had any issues with it. Look, we want responsible, law-abiding citizens to be able to carry openly. And so that's why we passed that bill, and it's received overwhelming support from Texans all across the state.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things that's playing out in the national narrative right now is relative to the NRA and then just individuals that really are carrying. There's almost a demonization that's going forward about individuals that carry, when in reality, most of the individuals that I know that are carrying, that have gone about by the rules to be able to do such a thing, are really individuals that are sacrificial, willing to lay down their life. And the reason why they're carrying isn't necessarily to flex, but really it was just, I want to be there. I want to be a helpful citizen relative to some of these issues.
That's right. And look, we have to look into the issues with respect to mental health and school safety. All these issues are on the table, and conservatives shouldn't be afraid to engage in these conversations. I'm certainly not. But one of the things that we have to continue to fight for is our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Those 4 words, shall not be infringed, are there for a reason. And the Second Amendment is supposed to protect all the other amendments, all the other rights we have. And so I'm going to continue to advocate for law-abiding gun owners in the state of Texas. But we're going to have conversations about school safety and about ensuring that our kids are safe when they walk into the doors of their public schools.
Just before we let you go, you do not have a primary opponent, but anybody who's turned on television recognizes right now there's a lot of negative campaigning. Any comments about what has been taking place here? Because when we beat up people that we agree with, because in some cases, because they are so similar in their views, sometimes you have to pick out some secondary issue to focus on. And what oftentimes happens is that people say, well, negative campaigning, I won't go out and vote at all. We need to have more people voting, not less, don't we?
We absolutely need to increase voter turnout, and seeing negative campaigning is unfortunate. I would say this, though, and this is an important point. Campaigns are meant to distinguish. You have to distinguish yourself from other candidates. But When negative campaigning turns personal and petty, and when you make things up from a personal perspective instead of sticking with the facts, then people's alarms should be going off. The facts are the facts, and we should not be afraid to talk about the facts. My background is my experience, my voting record is all out there. Should be brought to the voters. But when things turn personal and negative, it's such an unfortunate reality in our politics today, and we need to avoid it at all costs.
It poisons the well, and not only does it just it creates a distaste within voters' palate, but also it pulls them away from them. And if anything, what we continue to see is that voters aren't necessarily caring about this; they're caring about it, but they're becoming apathetic towards these issues.
That's right,
and it just continues to perpetuate a pattern that will inevitably not yield to good results moving down forward.
That's right, and I just want to encourage people of faith to vote, to take part in the process, to do your research, ask candidates the hard questions. We're accessible. My cell phone number is on my website. If someone has a question about my record, what I believe, what my stance is on a specific issue, call me. Let's talk about it together. We should be able to disagree in this country, but we should be able to do so respectfully.
Yes. And again, one of the things I've seen on some of the Facebook posts lately is, well, I've just had it with these negative ads, and a lot of them are the Senate race in Senate District 8, but they'll say, I won't vote at all. And I'm saying no, because that's the problem. These negative ads sometimes work by suppressing the vote. And so when you see negative ads and you say, well, then I won't vote for either of them, then you're just perpetuating that. I wish we could get to a point where people see negative ads and say, I'm just going to tune those out and still make a vote, because when you don't vote, you're actually reinforcing what some of these political consultants are saying, and that is, my idea is I can't get more people to vote for me, but I'll make sure my opponent gets less votes.
That's exactly right.
Just, and again, we have such low voter turnout during the primaries, as you well know.
That's exactly right.
More, don't we?
Please do not stay home from the polls. And if you have a question about a specific race, if you're confused about the ads you're seeing, the messages you're receiving, again, my strong opinion is that you should reach out directly to the candidates.
Yeah.
And if they're not responsive, if they don't respond, then I think that tells you something.
Yeah. In campaigning, there's a sensitivity issue. So every candidate that's moving forward is highly sensitive to the individuals that they're seeking to earn their approval and to earn the right. And so reach out to the candidates. If you see a negative ad, reach out to that candidate and say that's unbecoming. And especially if they're a Christian, moving forward with the idea that we're to respond in a graceful and truthful manner, that there's a distinguishing factor between issues and between personal matters.
That's right.
I think you need to continue to push forward, have your voice heard, and speak to these candidates, because they're highly sensitive during this time that they're trying to win approval.
That's right.
Again, the website is jeffleach.com. And again, if you don't know how to spell it, we have a link there as well. So it makes it very easy. He has his phone number there. We also have an opportunity for you to follow him on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all sorts of things. And I do, and certainly appreciate your service for us.
Well, look, thank you for what you do, what you're doing here, communicating our values and encouraging people to get involved, and keeping them engaged is so important. I so appreciate both of you, and look forward to being back soon.
Well, we're going to take a break. And, Nick, we have a lot more to talk about. In the second hour, we will be talking about Hubble Narnia, astrophysics, and C.S. Lewis. How does that fit together? Well, we'll get to that in the second hour, but we have to let Jeff head off to the airport. And so if you would like to join us in this last half hour here before we get into another conversation, you feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. And we'll get into a couple of issues, not the least of which all the news coming out of Florida, as we talk about Second Amendment issues. And we'll also talk a little bit more about negative campaigning, all that coming up right after this.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys, and what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151. and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. Nick Pitt's in studio with us, and we were talking with Representative Jeff Leach. And just before we left, we were talking about negative ads. And again, my argument to anybody is if negative ads cause you not to vote, then you're just perpetuating negative ads. If there was ever a time when negative ads had no impact, they wouldn't use them. But the point is they don't get you to vote for someone, but they suppress the vote for someone else. Now, I guess I need to, for just a minute, Nick, see if you agree. Some people broadly define negative ads. I think an ad that says, I voted for the Trump tax cuts and my opponent was going to vote against it, or my opponent was for sanctuary cities, I'm against him, or whatever. Those are comparison ads. I don't see those as negative. I see negative ads when this deep voice comes in and says, Bob Smith kicks his dog when he comes home from work at night, that kind of stuff. And it's always in black and white, and it's so ominous. Those are the ones where you just want to turn them off, and I think mentally we should turn them off, shouldn't we?
I think you make two great distinguishing points, because I think the broad consensus is that negative ads simply are just meant to disparage someone's character in order that you would vote for the other person. But there's an equally compelling point that's been made about negative ads, in that it's causing apathy within voters and keeping them from turning out, and that's increasingly what we're continuing to see. In a shocking twist, almost paradoxical, increasingly we're seeing decreasing number of individuals that are going to the voter booth. But what they're doing is they're raising their voice about how disgusted they are with the political process and the political discourse. Well, the reality is, by complaining about something that's wrong, all you're doing is two wrongs don't make a right. One of the beautiful things that you can do, especially in our open democratic process, that I highlighted just in the previous segment, is that we have the opportunity, because candidates are highly sensitive during the campaign process because they desire their votes. When you think about how few voters and how small the margins are for a significant percentage of these elected officials, especially in these local races, each vote counts. So when you raise your voice to one of these candidates that potentially could only win by a few hundred votes, they're going to hear you. And so it's increasingly important for us not necessarily to lambast, like you said, these comparative ads where individuals are saying, this person supports X thing, this person supports Y position. When they're going after character, when they're going after a person's personal life, that's just in a way that's disparaging. I think we're better than that. We're better than that.
And the other part that I would make is, as you just pointed out, we have a disproportionate opportunity to make an impact. If you go back and compare the number of people that vote in a presidential election compared to a primary, this is an off-year election. Mm-hmm. So, again, the number of people that vote in this primary right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, they're having 20 times the impact as a typical election because so few people will come out to these primaries. And yet, you know as well as I do, Nick, that sometimes what we have are people that complain about their choices in November. Well, if you're complaining about your choices in November, pay attention to the primary in March, because it's March 6th where these people in the state of Texas are going to have a chance to vote.
You have got to pay attention not only during the primary, but again, being highly attuned to these individuals that are kind of putting forward their messages. I would challenge the voters. It's not simply about just understanding what's wrong. We're all intimately acquainted with what's wrong. We experience it experientially, and we also know it when we hear about it or when we see it. We know it with our mind, and we experience it with our heart. But don't just tell me what's wrong, because we all know that. Elected officials are individuals that Teddy Roosevelt said that had the bravery to be able to enter into the political arena. Be somebody that's actually putting forward solutions to these issues. I think that's one of the things that I so appreciated about what Jeff was doing. It's simply not just the identification of wrong, it's being a proponent for what's right. Look for candidates to not only identify what's wrong, but then to make it full orb to see what's right.
One more thing I'll say before we move off of elections, because, again, it's coming up a week from this Tuesday. A lot of people, Nick, say, well, I don't know where to get information. Okay, here's a couple of points. You can go right now. Let's say you live in Dallas, or let's say you live in Collin County, or wherever you might be, maybe Tarrant County. You can type in like Collin County election information, Dallas County election information, and then you can pull out your voter registration card, find out which precinct you're in, and you can scroll down and it actually can get a sample ballot. And I do that every single time. So first of all, you can see who's running. Then you start looking down that ballot. Now, again, because I'm a precinct chairman and because I've been involved, I know most of these people, but you're going to say, okay, there are two people running for judge or county judge, or here's two people running for the Texas House. I don't know who they are. The next step is they all have Facebook pages.
Oh, my goodness.
You and I enjoy that. I'm old enough to remember when Facebook was not around, and it was really hard to get information. It's not hard to get information now. And then there are various voter guides out there. There's one that's been put together that looks at everything from Texans' Right to Life, Empower America, conservative groups, and all that, and it shows you how many endorsements they've received. So there's just so much more information that's available to your generation and now for us than ever existed just a few years ago.
Yeah, I think it's really important because we're inundated with information now. I think that's pretty clear that we just have a significant amount of information, and it's hard to kind of sift through it all. And so what I would encourage the voter to do is to understand, because we've been given such great liberty here in the U.S., understand the issues that are important to you. There's some listeners right now that they would be considered and classified as single-issue voters, that if they don't line up relative to the life issue, or if they don't line up relative to the gun issue, then that's really the make or break. Well, if that's it, then you need to very well be acquainted with that particular candidate's single issue. Understand, one, what are the issues that are important to you, and then two, do very deep dives into those issues, because you can very much find that information not only on their Facebook page or their Twitter or just on their website to be able to see. And if it's an incumbent, especially with what Representative Leach was saying, see how they're voting. Don't just tell me what they're saying. Tell me how they voted on these particular issues. Because, again, in this information age, we have so much information that's right available at our fingertips. But it's important for us not just to hear what people are saying and what they're typing and see what they're typing, but also see how they acted if they've been put into a position of power.
And again, if they are not maybe elected to a legislative session, so you don't have a voting record, one of the things that a lot of these voter guides do is they say, okay, well, judges haven't actually rendered decisions, and they're not going to tell you what they are. But if you see one judge that is, in many cases, receive money for abortion rights groups, Planned Parenthood, maybe National Organization of Women. You see another group that's been, individual that's been endorsed by American Family Association, Empower Texas, whatever. You kind of have a pretty good idea how that individual is going to eventually render judicial decisions as well. So just do your research, right?
Yeah, there's so much information that's readily available. And not only would I tell you that, but there's a multitude of intermediary organizations,
right.
Simply organizations that are helping to better understand the issue. And so if there's a right to life, if there's a life issue, if there's a gun issue, whatever that issue is, there more than likely is going to be some nonprofit, some think tank organization that's properly vetted these candidates to be able to do the hefty work to help you better understand what are the issues that I need to be talking about, what are the bills that they would be rendering, where have they received money, to really see, to put forward some of these things.
Well, again, we just wanted to give you a little bit of information on that. Speaking of information, we have a link to Jeff Leach's issues. One of the other articles I posted was what are called Broward's Cowards, came from the National Review.
Man.
We're learning a lot more about what happened about 10 days ago, and that is these deputies simply did not go in and confront the shooter.
And here's the thing, Kirby, there's a part of me that I want to be so sympathetic towards these towards our first responders,
right?
Because they're never called in to congratulate people. It's always during a breakdown of society, and there's a certain temperament that these first responders have to assume. I could never be a first responder because I have a flight. I'm not a fight. Yeah. Even though I go to boxing classes in the morning, but here's what I know. Because I know my temperament, I'm not in that position. These are individuals. This deputy was paid $75,000 a year because it believed that he had the capacities and responsibilities to be the fight, to run towards it. And to know that this individual, not just when he first got the call, but he waited outside the door for 4 minutes while he heard gunfire is despicable. It's just despicable. And then to know that that's taxpayer money that's put towards that end, and to know that there are children in there that are being subjected to gunfire in this fear, it just is. And then we got to a point where that was the last straw to talk about how the FBI was involved in this, and they passed over this, to talk about the sheriff's deputies and how the city lack of response to the city and then to see the breakdown relative to the family and all that. There's just so many issues that are percolating around this particular thing that we'll just have to continue to talk about.
Well, we'll take a break, but we'll come back, and we found out it wasn't just him, but with some of the others. This is while the sheriff is blaming the NRA when he knows in the back of his mind that his deputies didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Accept responsibility.
Whoa.
It's overwhelmingly you are responsible for this. When you have a deputy that is waiting outside the door for 4 minutes, accept responsibility, because we know this. It's just it's unacceptable.
It is. Well, I got Nick going, and we'll get you going if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll, in the second hours, get into some other issues, but we have just an opportunity to come back and talk a little bit more about that piece, which I think is a really good editorial, Broward's Cowards. And if you'd like to read it, it's on our website, along with some of the other articles we're going to be talking about today here at Point of View. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Can county commissioners open their own meetings with prayer? The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit recently prohibited Rowan County's commissioners from opening their meetings with prayer. But the federal courts of appeal are split over whether prayers offered by legislators at local government meetings are unconstitutional. In another one of our cases, Bournemouth versus County of Jackson, the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit approved of the very same practice. Opening government meetings with prayer is a centuries-old tradition that goes back to before the founding of our nation and continues to this day before Congress, state houses, and thousands of local governments across the country. It shouldn't be very controversial. The Supreme Court previously approved of the long-standing tradition of legislative prayer and its role in solemnizing policymaking sessions, encouraging lawmakers to selflessly seek the greater good, and acknowledging the role that faith plays in the lives of millions of Americans. In 1983 in Marsh v. Chambers and then again in Town of Greece v. Galloway, the Supreme Court held that prayers offered by private citizens before government meetings are fully consistent with the Constitution and an important part of America's history and heritage. But what if that citizen is an elected official? That's the question we hope the Supreme Court will now answer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Nick Pitt's with us, and one of the articles we've posted from the editors of the National Review, Broward's Cowards. Let's get back to that for just a minute. We now know the name of that deputy who did not go in, and we know that as soon as that information came out, he decided to retire so that he was out of the public eye. But the sheriff of this knew all sorts of things when we have this CNN town hall meeting. And even though he knows all of that, he spends all his time attacking the NRA. And we can talk about the NRA in just a minute, but he's almost been doubling down trying to justify what should be the natural and prescribed reaction for first responders, right?
Yeah. So when this news came out, we heard about kind of the idea that the deputy waited outside the building for 4 minutes on Thursday. And one of the past things, so I write the daily briefing on Friday morning. So I knew that last thing I want to do is I don't want to lambaste a police officer, because I recognize that they're first responders. I want to support them holistically. But I also, again, what I continue to say, faithful are the wounds of a friend. I want us to be acknowledging this particular vantage point. So I called one of my police officer friends, and I asked him, help me to understand what's going through his mind as well as what's being taught to young police officers. And now it varies relative to city as well as to state. But he says that, again, there is a position for police officers that they're carrying their pistol, but many police officers have a bigger gun, have a more powerful gun in their car. And so they're using their pistol to get to the car if they're hearing a more powerful gun. And then from there, going into the situation to restore peace, to put order back into place, because that's what police officers are. They're peace officers.
Right.
And what was fascinating is when I was listening to him, he says that his mentality, and again, most of the people that are around, his mentality are individuals that are moving towards that end of wanting to restore the peace. That's what they're built for. My friend, that's what he's built for. He's always the one, when we go out to eat, wants to have his back to the back wall and wants to always be looking at the door. He's just a caring individual that recognizes that he has been crafted in such a way to want to watch out for individuals. And so when we hear that over the past decade that there have been upwards of 23 calls by the family to the local police stations relative to this shooter, which we're not going to name. 2 months ago, the shooter had been threatened multiple times to kill students on social media. Last month, the family went to the FBI and they overlooked it. And then the day of, when the tragedy's happening almost 2 weeks ago on Wednesday, what we see is that this deputy waits outside for upwards of 4 minutes. And now we're finding out there are other deputies that are waiting outside. And then you have the sheriff that goes on national TV and continues to go on national TV. It's just disgusting, Kirby. Yeah. It's disgusting what's happening right now. Accept responsibility. Accept responsibility when there's been a breakdown, because then we can begin to move forward. Because at the end of the day, we don't want this type of behavior perpetuated relative to in the school and then in response to this as well. And it just creates more of this toxic environment. And at the end of the day, what we're seeing in this toxic environment is that students are losing their lives, which is not the way that it's supposed to be.
Yes. Well, and there's one more element, and that is, I don't want to say too much about the students who were actually survivors there, but some of these students are coming out and saying all sorts of things. And one of the students this weekend said, well, I don't have any problem with the fact that the deputy didn't go in, because who would want to be staring down the barrel of an AR-15? And so you almost have a further justification from one of the students that I think inaction was a good idea. No, it's not.
No, who is this? I respect him. I'm so grateful.
And they're all traumatized, and we're grateful that they survived.
Yeah.
Okay,
and so
not criticizing the student, but the comment is the issue I want to look at.
The idea that you can just overlook this blaring discrepancy, and then to know that this student survived, but another student of his, a fellow student of his, was a JROTC member that rushed into the line of fire in order to save his fellow students. And to say what he said, to excuse the behavior of the deputy, all for the sake of pushing an anti-gun agenda. Again, these are two separate conversations, but when you bring them and mesh them in together, not only do you continue to perpetuate this idea that it's just wrong. It's just wrong, Kirby. I'm so frustrated by it. I'm so frustrated because at the end of the day, I think that there needs to be a conversation relative to guns. There needs to be a conversation relative to mental health. There needs to be these type of conversations. But when you have these students that are putting forward, or not just students, when you have these individuals that are excusing the behavior of the deputy and a sheriff that is unwilling to accept responsibility, it's time to go. It's just time for
to go. And again, a couple of disclaimers I always like to issue. Number one, we support those in law enforcement.
Grateful.
If you don't think we do, you haven't listened to the programs we've done with Heather McDonald and everything else. We recognize the students have a right to speak. And again, we recognize some of them are traumatized. So, don't take everything at face value, all that. But still, the reality is that this is a very complex issue. As soon as you say mental health, Okay, how do we define who has access to a gun or who does not? When you talk about an instant background check, how much information, who gets those? These are complex issues, and when they're being discussed by young kids that don't understand all the issues, or by people that want to just give us a cliche or a platitude, we're not well served by that, are we?
And at the end of the day, you are more than willing. I think that's the beauty of America. You have an ability to lift your voice and to break the silence. But know that if you're going to break the silence, hopefully you're adding value to what this, because we increasingly in this media cycle that we live in, we have to value the, I think many of us value the silence right now. But if you're going to raise a position, you need to know, regardless of your age, that there's going to be another individual that has the capacity and as well as the freedom to be able to voice their opinion, to either one, clarify your statement, or two, to be able to combat your statement in a way that's just intellectually honest with one another. And one of the frustrating things, again, we need to understand that these individuals have been traumatized. They're victims of just an atrociousness that's happened. But we can't be driven by emotions, but we do have to acknowledge it. And it's just very frustrating.
I might mention that you mentioned your daily briefing. Let's talk about that for just a minute. The first article we have here is a link to the daily briefing. I've always said it's a must read. And if you find yourself right now saying, oh, for the first time I'm hearing some rational discussion about this gun control issue and want to actually have some opinions that have value, you're going to find that at the daily briefing. And this week, you, of course, are going to be addressing those issues. You also talk about a variety of other things. Kentucky, the angriest state in the union. Didn't know that until I read yours. And then you always end with some really humorous video. One of those little kid that's kind of going, don't drive fast, you know. Yeah. So there's some things that will make you smile. There's some references to music, and there's some ability for you, before even most of us get up, for you to tell us what are going to be some of the issues of the day.
Yeah, what I love about the daily briefing is, again, what I'm trying to do is it's kind of broke up into three particular points, hopefully a 5 to 7 minute read. The first section is really what's the news everyone's going to be talking about, and how do I think about it from a biblical perspective, of just everything from the idea that United Airlines and Delta Airlines have decided to kind of pull back from the special privileges that they give NRA members, to the closing ceremonies that happened in South Korea, but also Beijing is going to be the one that's going to be hosting the Winter Olympics in 2022, and then President Xi Jinping and his decision by the Communist Party in China to kind of revoke, at least make alterations relative to allowing him to have no term limits. And so we're continuing to see China move forward and establish a position of leadership in the world, as well as America first moving back from its leadership position in the world. Trying to make sense of the world and the things that you're talking about from a biblical perspective, but then some of the social science research about the most angry cities, the most sinful cities in the country that just came out by Wallet Hub, and how are we to think about this? And then at the end of the day, the funny videos to help you remember that the world is not all bad.
Yes.
So,
again, daily briefing, we have a link to it. It is free. And again, I think you will benefit from it. And I would not wish Nick Pitt's reading list on anyone. He's done the work for you, so I encourage you to subscribe. We're going to talk about the issues of astronomy and fantasy and so much more in the second hour. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter. Information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives. Because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth. And because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. In studio with me today is our good friend Nick Pitts, who normally is sitting in this chair. And Nick, I kind of traded out with you because I know these two individuals we're going to be talking about, but we're going to be talking about astronomy, fantasy, C.S. Lewis, all sorts of things. And so I really hope people will pay attention and also mark their calendars for March 20th.
It's a smorgasbord, so I'm really excited because I know about astronomy because my days at Austin Peay State University, I took stellar astronomy.
Oh, boy.
So I remember going out to in Dixon County in Tennessee. I remember us going out and taking a field trip one night. It was required during our class because there was a telescope out there in the middle of this field. And I didn't appreciate it at the time, but now I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, though.
Well, as a matter of fact, one of the locations when they had the the solar eclipse, I should say, was at your old alma mater there.
Oh yeah, Austin Peay State University. It's a beacon of apparently astrology. So we'll see.
Yeah, so NASA. And so anyway, we are going to go around the round table here. We're going to talk about what's happening March 20th, and you certainly want to mark your calendar. First of all, Byron Barlowe is a good friend, and of course he serves with me at Probe Ministries, research associate and individual that, of course, for many years was with Campus Crusade for Christ, now Crew. And Byron, it is great to have you back in studio again.
Thanks, Kerby. It's always good to be with you.
And we'll be talking with another individual, Daniel Ray, in just a minute. But let's see if we can, before we get to his brainchild of how this developed, there is this wonderful program that will be taking place at the Land Center of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. You know where that is.
Oh, yeah.
You graduated from there.
I'm intimately Evan Leno. And so Professor Leno, I had him for the Christian Home course when I was in seminary days.
So, again, this is going to be taking place March 20th. But, Byron, tell us a little bit about what is going to happen March 20th out there at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Well, it's going to be a beautiful marriage of imagination and reason. And that's one of the things that we need to tee up, you could say, today, because people are often going by images. It's an image-oriented culture. Many people spend more of their time online than in real life. And those are the kinds of things that we need to be going for, which is how to imagine the glories of God. And I was thinking that Dan's kind of used his relationships. I met him in class. He was one of the guys that impressed me the most about his ability to take the kinds of things that C.S. Lewis was writing about the heavens and making it something that you could really relate to and be motivated by. But he also is this amateur astronomer. So one day he took us up to his barn dominium. He lives in a barn with and he had the nice stuff for the cold night, the mulled cider and all that kind of thing. And another friend from class and her family, the little girls, were there. And all of a sudden, he takes his bookshelf wall and starts moving it. And it moves aside on rollers, and there is the field and the open sky. So his amateur astronomy has turned into an aficionado for, getting in touch with the kind of people we're going to have there at Southwestern. So I think what we're going to have is a unique brew of literature and science and the pictures that tell the story of the glory of God. So it's going to be a great event.
Daniel Ray is the other individual, and again, let's talk about that for just a minute, because Daniel Ray, of course, was involved with you at Houston Baptist University, did his master's thesis on Planet Narnia. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Also served in the 101st Airborne Division, and it just is great to have you in studio with us as well.
Thank you, Kerby. I am also an alumni of Austin P.
Screaming Eagles, yeah.
And Evan is actually heading up this thing at the seminary for us.
That's phenomenal. Okay, so when did you graduate Austin P?
In 2001.
Hey, okay.
Education degree.
That's phenomenal. Okay, so I was there from 03 to 07. So
yeah. I did the Army.
Yeah.
I did Fort Campbell, got out at Fort Campbell and went to Austin P. They're right there.
Yeah, yeah.
The post and the school. At first, Byron, I thought you said immature astronomer. I was like, well, he knows me pretty well. But really, the journey began back in 2012 when I bought Michael Ward's book for a prep for my middle school class. I was going to teach the Narnia Chronicles to middle schoolers. So I got this book background. Little did I know what it would do to me. A year later, I quit school and went to HBU to study under Michael because the book was so utterly fascinating. And what it talked about was C.S. Lewis's cosmological vision, medieval cosmological vision in the Chronicles of Narnia, which is an unprecedented literary discovery of the 21st century, you could argue, because for 50 years, no one knew what might lie behind Lewis's 7 books. So it turns out to be medieval cosmology, and Lewis uses medieval cosmology in Narnia, Dr. Ward argues, to point to Aslan. So Aslan envelops the character of medieval cosmology, all the attributes of medieval cosmology, all the aesthetic attributes that you would understand to be part of medieval cosmology, part of the 7 planets. And he baptizes them, basically, as Dr. Ward argues. He uses, not to promote astrology, but to promote how the heavens are spiritual symbols. And the spiritual symbols ultimately all point to Christ, as the heavens declare the glory of God. And the thesis in the book fascinated me, and I've always enjoyed astronomy. And so during my master's degree research, I met a Hubble Space Telescope scientist in Houston. And he was a gracious and wonderful gentleman. He has a public email, Dr. Anton M. Kokomower. And he was coming to Houston Baptist to do a presentation. And I emailed him through his public email and said, I'm coming from Dallas to come and see you. And he said, wonderful, we'll meet afterwards. And so after his presentation, I shook his hand. He was being grilled by an atheist who wondered how a Christian could work on the Hubble Space Telescope. And so the thing at that moment kind of struck me, and actually Anton and I exchanged emails, and he has stayed in touch with me for reasons unbeknownst to me. It's just been amazing. He's kind of been an email pen pal friend. And so Anton is a 20-year Hubble Space Telescope veteran. And through our communications, I introduced Michael to Anton via email, and I jokingly said, you guys should do a presentation together. And it was a joke, kind of. It was kind of a humorous thing. And they said, all right, Daniel, you take care of it.
And all of a sudden, we now have this.
Right, yeah. And I was like, don't you have people that do this? And so I began the quest a year and a half ago to find a venue. I enlisted Byron and other. I didn't know what I was doing. And so
That's why he enlisted me there.
Yeah. I ran into Paul Gould at Southwestern. And, actually, I emailed him because I saw he was an apologist. And I thought maybe Paul would be interested in this, and that's how it sort of blossomed at Southwestern. And then Byron has helped me raise funds for this. And so we are going to do something very ancient and so it's not anything new, Kerby. It's really something very old that I think has fallen out of favor and understanding in our modern culture. And we can talk about that later. But so that's what we're trying to do is combine 2 disparate disciplines and show how they have unity.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. You might want to ask a question today, because we'll be talking about everything from astronomy to fantasy. And again, on Tuesday, March 20th, from 7 to 9 at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, you're going to have those 2 individuals. We're going to talk more about that. This, I think, as we're getting into this, would be an opportunity for all of us who are Christians to maybe learn parts that we don't know. Maybe your person just loves fantasy and literature, but boy, science, you avoided those classes like the plague. Or maybe you're a scientist, but you just don't really understand some of that fiction. That would be really helpful. but I see this as a great evangelistic opportunity as well. So we'll talk more about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we have once again been hearing that we need to do something to stem gun violence. Even though most gun purchases are significantly regulated, are there any gun law reforms being proposed that make some sense? Well, Benjamin Durker, writing in The Federalist, proposes some reforms of the National Instant Criminal Background Check System that would make a difference. The system is composed of 3 databases, but not all relevant data is listed. For example, the Air Force failed to provide important information about the man who killed more than 24 people at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Legislation has been proposed to address this problem of inadequate records, but failed to pass in Congress. Another piece of legislation that has been proposed but not passed would increase criminal prosecutions of felons who tried to buy guns and would also criminalize straw purchases. The bill proposed by Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Charles Grassley would address the problem of people who lie on applications. Cruz says that in 2010 there were 48,000 felons and fugitives who lied and illegally tried to purchase guns. They prosecuted only 44 of them. David French writes about a way to deal with people who already have guns and pose a danger to society. It's called a gun violence restraining order. Various versions of these laws have been working their way through states, and it would empower family members and others close to a potential shooter to use the courts to temporarily take an individual's guns away. Obviously, it needs various safeguards. French shows how this law might have stopped at least 4 of the mass shootings in the last 4 years. We keep hearing that we need to do something. I think these types of common sense gun law reforms might actually prevent the next mass shooting. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with us, of course, Nick Pitts, but also Byron Barlowe and Daniel Ray, talking about this event that will be taking place March 20th. Mark your calendar right now from 7 to 9 p.m. It'll be at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the details in just a minute, and we certainly want you to begin to realize this is an opportunity for you to be educated, maybe in some area that you don't know more about, and to bring together what most people would say are 2 desperate, very different disciplines in the same discussion. And Byron, I mentioned just this idea of evangelism. You spend a fair amount of time on campus, University of Texas at Dallas and others. This, I think, would be a great event to invite to your friends. One of the videos we have here is Daniel Ray talking in an atheist group about this, which is interesting as well that they opened the door there. But talk about that. As somebody with Campus Crusade for Christ all these years, you understand how some of these seminal events can be very significant.
Absolutely. And what we're finding is today, people, especially now, have to grow into this kind of thing. So the exposure to this kind of a wedding of the irrational and the imaginative is something that I think will open up doors. We kind of have to go in the side door a lot of times with the internationals who come. Pantheists, Hindus have a very different worldview. Something like this can really help reach them. But also the Americans, the people who are, again, living online, looking at imagery and processing the world that way. So for them to show up and see these incredible shots of the Hubble Space Telescope on the screen by the guy who's in charge of compiling them is an amazing side door entrance, but also to imbue that with meaning. And that's one of the things that we learned in the Houston Baptist program for apologetics, is that if you really don't imbue things with meaning, you can have the best airtight arguments. And people can say, oh, okay, that makes sense, shrug, and move on. And that's often what's happening with students. But, one of the things that's been a joy is to work with Dan and others in the area with skeptics. So a lot of atheists come to local events that we're part of. And one of the things I'm most excited about is the fact that there are some atheists that are already promoting the event.
Isn't that
here.
something? Yeah. Daniel, talk about this for just a minute. These are two high-quality individuals. Michael Ward, if people are not familiar with, is just an incredible scholar. And I think anybody, even if they don't know much about Hubble telescope, would have to say, anybody that's a scientist involved with that, we're talking about people that could charge an enormous amount just for a speaking fee. And to bring those two together, this is almost like a grade B miracle, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing that this has taken place.
It gives me the chills when I think about it. In fact, I'm going to have both gentlemen in my little Honda Civic at the airport next month, so it's, I can't believe that. But really, Kerby, excuse me, the foundational theological idea that I had in my brain was that Jesus is the creator of the universe, created the stars. And then he also entered into the stories that he wrote for us before the foundation of the world. And so Jesus creates the stars, and then he enters into the stories that he has written for us. As Psalm 139 says that all of our days have been written beforehand. And so Jesus takes on human flesh and comes into our stories. And I think that's what brings these two things together for me, as the scriptures say in Colossians and John, that everything is created by him and for him. Mm-hmm. And so in all things hold together by the word of his power. And so there's a wonderful, Michael and Anton both have this incredible ability to take their scholarship and not dumb it down, but translate it. Mm-hmm. So you're speaking in a way that people can understand, and that's what's so amazing about these guys, is they're gifted communicators as well, and they can convey a very complicated and deep message to people in a way that most people like myself can understand it.
Oh, I think one of the things that I'm so fascinated about this is that we're increasingly living in a skeptical age where kind of there's my truth and there's your truth, and it's increasing. It's very hard to be able to engage in a conversation or to have arguments with one another because we no longer have shared facts. And I think what's so important for what you all are doing, especially at Southwestern, is the sense that you're appealing to something that we all can share because we cannot experience it all together relative to the heavens. And it has the propensity and the opportunity. I'm always reminded by the Augustine quote that when the logic in the front door of the mind is closed, it allows for beauty in the back door of the mind to be open. And it really is a very beautiful opportunity for skeptical or for kind of atheist friends to help them better understand, how can I make these arguments that point towards a creator?
Right. And dialogues that I've had with unbelievers, and I've had quite a few in the last year or so, the heavens, the universe is kind of like, and I don't mean to equate atheism to a religion, but it is kind of like their cathedral, if you will. And Carl Sagan, among others, is the sort of the patron saint, if the patriarch of high church atheism, if you want to call it that, without denigrating my atheist friends at all by saying that. But that's what's on their minds, is the universe, and knowing the language of not only the universe but your friends and what they're interested in is very important. If I may take just a minute to kind of explain that what we're actually doing by bringing a Hubble telescope scientist and a Lewis scholar together, that astronomy and literature, how they go together. This is actually a very ancient idea that was birthed in the logical foundations of the trivium and the quadrivium, the classical forms of education. And there's a wonderful book that was written by a late nun. Her name was Sister Miriam Joseph. She was a professor of English for almost 30 years at St. Mary's College. And she explains this idea of classical education and the propensity that it has for unification, the way it helps students to see things holistically. She says the essential activity of the student is to relate the facts learned into a unified organic whole, to assimilate them as the body assimilates food, or as a rose assimilates food from the soil and increases in size and vitality and beauty. A learner must use mental hooks and eyes, to what Byron's point was saying, to join the facts together to form a significant whole. And that is what the ancients did. They could combine grammar, logic, and rhetoric that prepared students' minds to engage in astronomy and music and the arts. And everything was a comprehensive whole. You could speak intelligently about different subjects without having to specialize in one particular one.
You know, I was just thinking about that, Nick, in terms of the way the university used to be, una veritas, one truth. There used to be a time in which all the disciplines came together. Now, the physicists are over here, the philosophers are over here. They may not even talk to each other except maybe at a faculty senate. And, of course, I know one of the things you've been trying to do at DBU is bring that together. And this is one of those opportunities to really go back to an ancient idea.
Yeah, it's the beautiful opportunity to allow the disciplines to inform one another and then also to help them better understand how do they convey truth in a way that appeals to a broader audience. You never want to forsake specialization, because I think there's a beauty to be found in relative disciplines digging deeper or exploring further that which is unknown into the academic world. But I think especially it's important for us to be able to understand that's a good end, but there has to be results from that end, which could be the opportunity for other individuals to come along and better grasp that. And what not better way than allowing the various disciplines to come and, I guess I would say, tweak the language in such a way that it might appeal to their particular demographic.
I think this is just an incredible opportunity. And so, again, mark your calendars for March 20th, 7 to 9. But one of the questions, Byron, everybody's thinking is, okay, what's it going to cost? Okay, you bringing in these highfalutin speakers. We've posted this on the website, and people have got to believe that this is a typo. $10?
You know, that's the mere ticket price, right?
Yes.
We'll steal from C.S. Lewis and say it's mere ticket price.
Students get $5.
Students are $5, and so I think
they've got to believe this is a typo, but it's not.
Right. You know, some generous donors have stepped forward, and these gentlemen are like a lot of the people who I used to deal with at leaderu.com.
Right.
They just want their information and those ideas out there. They're not about what they can sell or branding themselves. A little bit reclusive. One of the things that I regret about this is it's not going to be recorded, but that's going to drive us into a more of an incarnated show-up experience, face-to-face. So maybe it's better that it's not recorded and we're mediated out of touch with each other. One of the things that I wanted to say regarding everything that's been shared, Dr. Holly Ordway in the program has written a book, a very important book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination.
Yes.
And in it, she makes this statement: the apologist must be willing to start small and be able to cultivate meaning at different levels and in different ways. So following on both of the gentlemen here, in this work, rational and imaginative apologetics are intertwined as we present the truth in both abstract and imaginatively realized ways. So showing up with stuff about space and physics, and showing up with stuff about literature and the meanings of things behind it in the heavenlies, which is a very biblical concept. This, as they said, is a good marriage. With both the imagination and the intellect engaged, the will has a solid foundation upon which to act.
We're going to take a break, and we will continue our conversation about the imagination right after this.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. If you would like to join our conversation, perhaps you have some questions about astronomy or astrophysics or fantasy or C.S. Lewis, this is your opportunity to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. In studio with us today, of course, Nick Pitts, who normally sits in this chair on this broadcast that we do for our local station here in Dallas. We also have Byron Barlowe and Daniel Ray. And if you're just joining us, let me just mention again, we're talking about this wonderful opportunity, Astrophysics and Fantasy, Hubble Meets Narnia. Takes place March 20th, 7 to 9 p.m. It will be at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I broke the news that if you're a student, it's going to cost you all of $5. And if you're a non-student, it'll cost you $10. And if you can't afford it, I'll scholarship you because I just think you need to be there. And Byron, we were talking about just the evangelistic opportunity because, you know, imagination, as Nick was pointing out just a minute ago from the Augustine quote, sometimes is a way through beauty to go in the back door. And some people have their intellectual grid up here, but we just find another way to get in there and help them begin to see the glory of God in the heavens, right?
Right. You know, it's not just skeptics who've been affected by the reductionism that science and modernism has brought. And what that really means is that there's a worldview that we've all been affected by that says you got to take everything and put it on the table, cut it apart, and deconstruct it. And then what does that do? When you cut things apart, it kills them. And so the very meaning of the heavens and the biblical nature of the habitation of the heavens with heavenly beings is something that we forget about. And so if you're a skeptic, you could be operating from a meaning deficit rather than belief in implausible concepts, things that just don't make sense to us as biblical believers. But you could just be saying, well, you know, I get what you're saying, but it didn't mean anything to me. So that's what we run into on campus with even students who've been in youth group and grown up in church. There's this split that says, well, that's that private religious stuff. And that really is kind of like something that we decide to believe because mom and dad did or whatever. And then there's this science stuff that's real truth. So I think what we're doing is closing the gap there and taking away the split that people need to remember.
Daniel, what about this opportunity? Because we have Michael Ward, and of course we have Anton. Some people might say, and I think you've already alluded to this, that these are pretty smart individuals, but they also know how to communicate at a level that I think most of our listeners will be able to appreciate and understand. True?
Absolutely, Kerby. The giftedness of these gentlemen possess in terms of communication skills, having seen both of them give presentations to a larger audience publicly, I can attest to the fact that it doesn't matter if you're 5 or 50 or 85, you will derive something from these presentations because you don't have to know a thing about astrophysics or a thing about C.S. Lewis to be able to come and appreciate, just like you wouldn't know a thing about it going into seeing a movie. You go and you know that you might get something from that, or you anticipate that there is something that will touch you. So you spend your $10. In the same fashion, that these gentlemen can convey their subject matter so wonderfully and so simplistically that anybody can derive something from this. I have friends who are bringing their children, and so this is open to that, and it's going to be a wide and diverse audience. I have an atheist friend and his family coming as well. And I stood up in an atheist group and promoted this. I don't know how many more skeptics and atheists might come, but it would be wonderful if they did. But not just to donk them on the head as an evangelistic tool, but to really open up the dialogue and to really see the meaningful fantasy-like nature of our existence, which is one of the giftedness of Lewis's imagination. He could make a fantasy story and make you realize that you are living in a story of the imagination of the Creator, which is far greater than anything I could put on paper, right? And so that's what Lewis does, and you know, through the wardrobe and through Narnia, we get a better appreciation for our own world. And so I just wanted to mention something about Dr. Kokomoor and his work. One of the most iconic objects that Dr. Kokomoor has put together, he was on the team that imaged the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Now, what the Hubble Ultra Deep Field is a mosaic of 10,000 galaxies. And basically, Hubble goes around the Earth at every 90 minutes at an altitude of about 340, 350 miles. And every rotation, it took 2 pictures from a spot of sky, no bigger than a pinhead, no bigger than the eye of Lincoln on a penny held out at arm's length. And when I was at UTD with Byron the other night, I was talking to the students about the perception of what this is like, and I had them look at the ceiling tiles. And I said, find the smallest point you can on the ceiling tile. Now, that spot of sky is the same size as the image of the 10,000 galaxies that were taken. So Anton processed 800 images and put them into a single mosaic. He oversaw this whole process and created this amazing panorama of galaxies, and that's just one tiny sliver of the cosmos. And so it's an amazing thing, and he can convey what's going on there in just a wonderful, rich, meaningful language that you don't have to know the mechanics or the equations behind that.
Nick, I was just thinking that it's new meaning to the heavens declare the glory of God.
Yeah, I think about it from a perspective to kind of go back, double back on what I said relative to the idea that the heavens are something that we all share to a large degree, in the sense that we can all experience it, and especially for those that are out in the country that don't have the city lights that are blinding them from being able to see the heavens. But then I just think about the increasing need for the Christian imagination to be flourishing right now and to be active. To a certain degree, I think one of the beautiful things about what Narnia does is it reimagines a different type of world, especially with what was so different than Lewis's world at the time. And I think about our world specifically. You think about how much, again, the American society has never been co-aligned with the kingdom of heaven, obviously. But there used to be day that there were blue laws. There were certain instances and entities that did try, that inculcated kind of some of those biblical values. Well, increasingly, I guess we would say that we're slouching more towards Gomorrah now. Mm-hmm. We're increasingly not looking like the biblical narrative, what the kingdom of heaven would. And it seems as though there's going to be a great need for Christians to be able to utilize their imagination to make his kingdom come, his will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right?
That's right. You know, I was thinking on the way here, the heavens are telling of the glory of God. And what we're doing here is inviting some gentlemen to come in from disparate disciplines, put together, to tell of the heavens telling of the glory of God. And we get to see the imagery on screen. And so you've got lots of social changes happen because of imagery. You know, you're starting to see the abortion movement take a turn years ago, especially with 3D imagery. It harkens back to Wilberforce when he took people on the boats over to smell and see what it was like to be near a slave boat. Well, you know, seeing is believing for most people. And so this is a way in. One of the deepest and most inspiring things I ever saw was some earlier pictures at the observatory in San Diego. And I just sat down. I could not stand. And I worshiped for I don't know how long. I just could not help it. It was a natural response. So what you've got now is you've got kind of an interpretation going back past that modernism I was talking about with the cutting apart on the table. You got a pre-modern worldview telling you about, oh, yeah, when I read in Psalm 8 about the heavens and other places in Scripture, that's what God was saying. So it's really fun to be able to reflect that. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and we're going to tell about that and then show it.
And, you know, it took the imagination of Lyman Spitzer, a Princeton astronomer who came up with the idea of the telescope in 1946. It took human imagination to come up with a flying telescope, especially one that orbited the Earth. And so there's a great deal of imaginative concepts going on throughout the discipline of astronomy. And really quickly, when Albert Einstein was visiting the United States in the 1930s with his wife, he took a tour of Mount Wilson Observatory in California, where Edwin Hubble had made his monumental discoveries with the 100-inch telescope. And the astronomers were impressed with the telescope, and they thought that Mrs. Einstein would be impressed as well. And they told her, said, "Ma'am, this is what has helped us understand the shape of the universe." And she says, "Well, my husband does that on the back of an envelope." You know, so there's, in other words, there's different ways of understanding the universe through the written word, through the abstractions of mathematics, through story and through narrative. It all kind of combines into one harmonious whole. And the ancients understood this, I think, better than we do.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Einstein quote. So he says that imagination embraces progress, right? Whereas knowledge is limited, imagination embraces this movement towards progress, which stimulates kind of this catalyzing force to help us to be able to, significantly pursue after these particular more access to information, but also to that action stemming from that.
Right.
We're taking a break, but when we come back, we'll take your phone call if you'd like, 1-800-351-1212, or sit back. But I'm giving you an assignment. First of all, there is a video that you can watch there that will give you some information. There's also an opportunity for you to sign up, and I know they would appreciate getting an advance notification of the fact that you might want to go on March 20th. We'll be back right after this.
Sure thing.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Can county commissioners open their own meetings with prayer? The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit recently prohibited Rowan County's commissioners from opening their meetings with prayer. But the federal courts of appeal are split over whether prayers offered by legislators at local government meetings are unconstitutional. In another one of our cases, Bournemouth versus County of Jackson, the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit approved of the very same practice. Opening government meetings with prayer is a centuries-old tradition that goes back to before the founding of our nation and continues to this day before Congress, state houses, and thousands of local governments across the country. It shouldn't be very controversial. The Supreme Court previously approved of the long-standing tradition of legislative prayer and its role in solemnizing policymaking sessions, encouraging lawmakers to selflessly seek the greater good, and acknowledging the role that faith plays in the lives of millions of Americans. In 1983, in Marsh versus Chambers, and then again in Town of Greece versus Galloway, the Supreme Court held that prayers offered by private citizens before government meetings are fully consistent with the Constitution and an important part of America's history and heritage. But what if that citizen is an elected official? That's the question we hope the Supreme Court will now answer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. In studio with us, Nick Pitts, as well as Byron Barlowe and Daniel Ray, talking about, again, this wonderful opportunity, which I hope you'll take advantage of, Tuesday, March 20th, 7 to 9 p.m. at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I want to thank our friends there at the Richard Land Center for doing that. And just before we went to a break, Byron, we were talking about Albert Einstein. You've got another Albert Einstein quote, which I thought was kind of intriguing as well.
You know, Albert Einstein said a very amazing thing. He said, if you want to raise smart kids, read them fantasy. If you want to raise smarter kids, read them more fantasy.
Wow.
So here's an astrophysicist, a mathematician extraordinaire, a guy who's in the abstract world, but using his imagination incredibly actively to get outside the box and to defy the history and the snobbery in his discipline. So he was a guy who would be all over Narnia if it had been written, I believe.
Yes. Let's talk about that for just a minute, Daniel, because you did your master's thesis on Planet Narnia. Some people might want to buy that book, but there's a simpler one that people might want to read ahead of time, Narnia Code. Mm-hmm. Talk about some of that, and especially help us understand what Michael Ward will be doing, talking about C.S. Lewis and Narnia.
Okay, first of all, Michael's going to be talking about a lesser-known aspect of Lewis's works. Lewis was fascinated by medieval cosmology, and he was a professional literary scholar. He wrote the Oxford History of the English Language, 16th century excluding drama. That was Lewis's life work. He was also an apologist, for which many of his professional colleagues at Oxford and Cambridge sort of frowned upon. But he felt like he had to do that. And he was also a writer of fantasy. So he wrote the Ransom trilogy, which is Lewis's science fiction trilogy he wrote in the 1930s. And then in the late 1940s, after a loss of a debate with a Catholic philosopher, Lewis started to reconsider how to communicate gospel truth, taking theology from a more rigid syllogistic point of view and trying to communicate it imaginatively. And so Lewis kind of challenged himself and said, if I can't communicate the gospel in fairy tale, then maybe I don't know the gospel. And so Lewis tried to take the gospel and put it into fairy tale form. And so for years, ever since its inception, its first publication with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in 1950, people have been suggesting that the 7 books of the Chronicles represented the 7 deadly sins or the 7 sacraments. So there's been no shortness of effort in people trying to figure out what Lewis was doing. Everybody knows that there's some Christian overtones in the book, obviously Aslan, but people believed that there was something deeper to it. And so Michael Ward, over a decade ago, was reading some of Lewis's poetry and stumbled across a poem of Lewis's called The Planets. He knew the poem existed, and he came across a line that said, guilt past, winter past, and guilt forgiven. And it was a key to Michael's digging into the idea that Lewis used the 7 planets of medieval cosmology in the Chronicles of Narnia, and then just went off like a wildfire on dry grass, doing a vast amount of research to prove, to demonstrate that this actually was the case. And this book has gotten critical acclaim. There have been people who have read through it who do not disagree. This has been N.T. Wright has commented on it. And so anyway, what it is Lewis's, the 7 planets in the medieval cosmology, the sun and the moon were considered planets, but they all would wield an influence. This is kind of getting into astrology, but Lewis was not condoning the astrology. He was just saying that the symbolism that people attach to these objects, like Jupiter and the moon and things, actually have spiritual significance. So in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the dominant planet is Jupiter. Jupiter in the medieval time was said to exert a kingly, jovial, gift-giving influence. And Lewis says, no, it's not the planet that does this. It's Jesus. It is the Lord Jesus. In personal letters, he said the Narnian Chronicles are all about Christ. But what Lewis is doing is what Byron is talking about, is infusing the meaning behind the planetary influences to Christ himself. So he baptizes the paganism, and instead of the planet giving us a joyful, jovial influence, it's Jesus through what he has created, demonstrating his invisible attributes to us. And so all throughout the book where you see the Jovian influence, by Jove, that's where this comes from. And Lewis is using this to point not back to the planet ultimately, but back to Christ. And that's his thesis.
Nick, I was just thinking, after everybody goes to the March 20th event, they're going to go back and read Narnia tales in a very different sort of way, aren't they?
Yeah, all this talk about C.S. Lewis and Einstein, it reminds me, probably one of my favorite writers is G.K. Chesterton, and just kind of the wit that he has to him. And he has this little line that he says, fairy tales are more than true, not just because they tell us that dragons exist, but they tell us that we can beat them. In the sense that there's these stories that yes, they point us to a particular truth that's point off, but also our capacity in the midst of those as well to be a part of it.
Right. And lest we think that we're just stuck in the past here, Stephen Hawking's former colleague Roger Penrose has written a book called Fashion, Faith, and Fantasy, in which he suggests that fantasy has a legitimate role to play in how we're trying to interpret the universe. It is so bizarre that the only thing that we really have in our lives to compare it to is fantasy literature.
I think that's like an important point, too, because I think maybe some of our audience is thinking to themselves, well, I'm not in theology right now. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an astronomer. What does this have to do with me? Well, I think for the Christian that's moving and living, you're very keenly aware that the biblical narrative does not seem to illuminate how you should live as a Christian, as a data analyst or as an accountant. Well, that's why the imagination is so important. You're taking the biblical principles that you read in the scriptures that are living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, and using your imagination in such a way that you might manifest the faithful presence of God in those particular areas. And so it's increasingly important for for the Christian not only to try to build out and try to build a more strengthen your imagination, one, but two, utilize and put into place that imagination not only in the places on Sunday and on Wednesday, but also Monday through Friday as well in your workplace.
Right.
So do you mean if I'm an accountant, that I can be somehow imaginative in that? Yes. And, I think that we've missed a lot of the role of work and the role of us as illuminating bodies in the world, like moons or whatever. And we have kind of gone with that modern separation. So we need to get back to that pre-modern worldview that says, no, the heavens declare the glory of God here on earth. Of course, we know that there's below the earth. There are influences that we don't recognize or give shrift to anymore. I was talking with a pastor from India yesterday, and his wife gave her testimony. They just took for granted that her seeing a vision of Jesus when she was sick and him telling her, no, it's not your time. They think you're dying. Go back. They took that for granted, and she was decades before she believed in Christ. But in the West, that would have been explained away. So I think that we need to come back together with our imaginations to say, this is real.
Let me just, before we run out of time, give you an assignment. First of all, to go to our website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says See More, and you'll have the information so that you can sign up. We also have some buttons there, a share button, so that you could put it on your Facebook page, or you could put it on your Twitter account. You could send it as an email. I hope you'll take the time to educate some other people in your church and invite everyone to come. You've got homeschool families coming, right? And you've got atheists coming. Right. Matter of fact, we got atheists coming, so I hope we have enough Christians coming here, so it isn't just an atheist gathering with a couple of Christians speaking. So, Nick, I'm sure this is the first time you've had a chance to hear about this, but the moment I heard about this, I just said we've got to do this on Point of View, right?
Yeah, this is phenomenal. Again, to be able to tap into this particular audience, one, but then also to see how this applies into the everyday. I think this is just keen point of view.
Well, again, astrophysics and fantasy, Hubble meets Narnia. And Daniel, this is coming to fruition, again, March 20th, right?
I can't believe that a silly idea I had a year and a half ago has raised money and is at a seminary and is on the radio now. This is crazy.
Yeah, it is.
Imagination at work. Right?
Well, and it's amazing because it to me, I'm nobody. And it reminds us all that the heavens are personal and the one who created them knows you intimately so well that he can use you too in a fantasy-like story.
You can find it all at pointofview.net. Want to thank Doug and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. See you back here tomorrow.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe